from the University of Florida, David Geggus, is here. If he could come forward. There you are. And if the panelists could come up to the front, that would be helpful as well.
Clearly, nowadays, the Congolese are finally getting their due in African American studies. Although West Central Africans make up some 45% of all the African migrants who arrived as slaves in the Americas, among whom Congolese must have been the majority, they were for a long time overshadowed in the history of American slavery by their West African counterparts. A Yoruba-centric focus generally dominated in Afro-Brazilian and Afro-Cuban studies. Haitian Kongo was what generally presumed to be an overwhelmingly West African and Creole creation. Kongo influence on some Creole languages went largely unnoticed, and Jamaica's Kumina religion, introduced by Congolese indentured servants, was attributed to either Efefon or Akan-speaking slaves. This panel, and more generally this conference, marks the considerable shift that has taken place over the last 35 years or so in the mental geography of African American studies, thanks to the work of a variety of scholars, including Suzanne Commerce-Evin, Lydia Cabrera, Monica Schuler, Vincent Price, Robert Thompson, John Thornton, and others. In my own field, the Haitian Revolution, which is currently being overtaken by Kongo mania, I'm inclined to think the shift has already gone a bit too far. Our three papers span a remarkably large swathe of the Americas, South, North, and Central, from Southeast Brazil to New England, and societies that were Lusophone, Anglophone, Francophone, Hispanophone, and Dutchophone. That would be my only attempt at humor. I'm sick of that humor. They concern regions where the Congo presence varied enormously. On one extreme is Brazil. It was the destination of nearly 70% of all enslaved West Central Africans who reached the New World. And West Central Africans constituted fully 70% of all the slaves who disembarked in Brazil. This proportion reached an astonishing 86% for the ports of Southeast Brazil. Arguably, no other part of the Americas was so tightly linked to just a few African cultures. And this relationship was sustained for some 250 years or more. This then is the demographic context and underpinning of the performance culture analysed by Marina de Menezes Sousa. Yet we learn that various ethnic groups in Brazil, and not just those from West Central Africa, formed brotherhoods and celebrated their kings. And it was not until the 19th century that the term King of Congo was adopted. It was not clear to me, and perhaps Marina could comment further on this, whether this reflected the increasing influx of West Central Africans into Brazil at that time, or whether the term rather was becoming a fictive and collective sort of term, henceforth divorced from ethnic identities. I'm also curious if we know why and when brotherhoods adopted the figures of kings and queens. Is it an African-American innovation, as I assume, or was there a medieval Portuguese precedent, as I believe I read somewhere? Gerard de Wolf's paper takes us to an entirely different type of society where people of African descent were a small minority, where the slave trade functioned at a very low level and lasted barely a century, and less than a quarter of enslaved arrivals came from West Central Africa. The region, which sent 3.4 million migrants to Brazil, sent only 90,000 to North America, of whom very few can have ended up in New York or New England. It would be hard to think of a less promising environment for a Congo across the waters. Whereas weight of numbers can easily explain cultural impact in southern Brazil, a different solution is required to construct a Congo reading of the Pinkster and Black Election Day celebrations. Jerome ingeniously combines some scraps of information about New Amsterdam's slave population with the concept of a uniquely influential charter generation to suggest, if I've understood correctly, that black fraternal organizations may have existed in the Northeast for a century prior to their first recorded appearance in the mid-18th century prior to the first recorded appearance in the mid-18th century of the processional cultures in question. He notes that this weakens the distinction drawn by Ira Berlin between Iberian and non-Iberian colonies as regards the presence of autonomous black institutions. I would add that the French Caribbean provides further evidence that might support this challenge. Although the French did not sponsor sodalities as did the Iberians, slaves in both Saint-Pierre de la Martinique and Cap Français nonetheless organized their own societies and chose kings and queens and held lavish processions. The question I have, just to play devil's advocate, is this: are we obliged to regard the associative impulse expressed in secular organizations like the Pinkster and Election Day as having anything necessarily to do with either Congo or Catholicism? Clearly, plenty of West Africans who lacked the Congolese prior acquaintance with Catholicism were willing to join brotherhoods and cabildos de nación in the Iberian colonies, to elect kings and to hold parades. And maybe they also regarded those activities as an extension of their African experience in religious, secret, or mutual aid societies, much as the Congolese reacted to the New World Catholicism in the interpretations of both Marina and Jerome. Whereas Marina and Jerome's papers deal with the syncretic aspect of Congo religious culture and affirm its centrality to Congo identity, Maureen Warner-Lewis surveys the more indigenous elements of the culture that have survived in the Caribbean. In terms of slave trade demography, the Caribbean received almost as many African migrants as did Brazil, but a much smaller proportion came from West Central Africa. In the aggregate, it was close to the quarter or so we found in the North American trade, but there was a great deal of variation within the region. For example, Congolese made up nearly half of the migrants to French Saint-Domingue, but only 1 in 7 of those who disembarked in the British West Indies. As our time is short and I've asked to be brief, I will just state that my principal question I would like to ask Maureen is, can we see more of that whining and waste work, please?
Thank you very much. I think I would invite you to respond to David's question.
Thank you for the comments. And 15 years ago, when I did the research for the PhD dissertation, I wasn't very familiar with the issues of slavery and traffic, and my interpretation was based on symbolic and cultural issues. And so I understood that in the 19th century there were the Black Catholic identity were consolidated around the idea of Catholic Congo, and I worked only in this symbolical level. That now I know that in the 19th century the amount of Congolese slaves increased a lot. So I think my knowing of this reality linked to the slavery just confirmed my interpretation that was based on symbolic level, because the arriving of the Congolese certainly feed, I don't know the words, but increased the connection with the Congo kingdom from these kings and queens. But I continue understanding that the symbolic level is as important as the real arriving of Congolese slaves at the southeast Brazil. And the kings and queens, the only brotherhoods that has kings and queens are the Black Brotherhoods, the Black Men Brotherhoods, and the Holy Spirit Festival. They have, in the Holy Spirit Festival, they have an emperor and a court, but it's the only one. The other brotherhoods doesn't have kings and queens. So I think the Black Brotherhoods absorbed this specific element from one specific brotherhood and turn this element their own because they connected with their own past. They choose. My argument is that they choose the elements they wanted to use to construct a new identity. And they choose the king and the emperor from the Holy Spirit. And so, trying to answer the question if the kings and queens were invention of the Black Brotherhoods, they were not inventions of Black Brotherhoods, but the Black Men Brotherhoods choose to incorporate that specific element and not the other one.
I would like to comment briefly on the question of how secular or how Catholic these organizations were that existed, that were built by slave communities in New York. And it is obviously a difficult question to answer because we have so frustratingly little information about those associations. It seems to me clear that the main focus is mutual aid. Whether these associations also had a religious component is very difficult to answer. What I do see is certain indications that there might be a religious element to it, a Christian Catholic element to it. And for instance, if you look at Pinkster basically is the holiday of Pentecost, is a very important Catholic holiday, was also in the Kingdom of Kongo an important holiday. So this might be considered, a Catholic Christian element. There's no doubt that Catholic elements do exist among the slave population in New York. At a very early stage with the Charter generation, but also later, right? I gave an example from the 18th century, and then we have this influx from slaves who are prisoners of war, basically, as a result of warfare between Britain and Spain, and who end up also in New York and bring their Catholic heritage with them, and might have had some impact on these associations. Which I think is clearly visible in the context of the information we have about the 1741 plot in New York, where you do find several references to Christian, potentially Catholic elements, like there's reference to baptism, there's references to crucifixes. So all that combined could at least allow the suggestion that these associations might indeed have had a Christian Catholic component.
Yeah, I think that the Catholic and religious connection is extremely valid, but I think we also need to remember that African indigenous societies had their kings and chiefs, and the people, the community, was very committed to certain forms of indigenous forms of government and leadership, so that even in a place like Jamaica with a very strong Protestant tradition, for instance, a certain Yoruba or Nago based community in Western Jamaica in the 19th century had someone that they nominated their king. Or in Trinidad, they had kings. No, Trinidad had a stronger Catholic influence, but certain societies like the Igbo and so on had their king, or they would call them their headman. But every ethnic society or group, enclave, had a leader who collected money from the community in order to buy land. This is after slavery. Or certainly the mutual aid was crucial under slavery and after. Even now in the Caribbean, people put aside pieces of wood to make their coffins, to ensure that they have a decent burial. So burials were very important. If you read at Columbia and so on, St. Peter Claver and all that, he was aware that the African communities in Cartagena and so on existed to provide mutual aid for those who were sick, those who were old, and for everybody when they died. So we have to look at the indigenous impulses within African societies to have and nominate leaders. In some cases they were called headmen, some cases they were called king, emperor, whatever. And of course there was a synthesis of these indigenous ideas with, the cabildos, the confradías, and so on. So I think that you're looking at influences coming from just more than one direction.
Thank you. I guess we're a little bit over, but I think we have time for a couple of questions. Other questions in the audience? Can I ask?
Actually, my question is linked to what the previous questions. If you put a lot of emphasis on black Catholicism or Kongo Catholicism, but as far as I understood, the Catholicism or Christianity was a kind of the religion instrumentalized by the elites, so by the which the nobles used to distinguish themselves from the common people. So and slaves, you would expect them not to be from, but maybe I don't know enough about slavery, but to be from rather the common people and not from the nobility. So how do you link this? I see some kind of contradiction on this this importance on Catholicism among slave populations and the association with nobility in the Congo kingdom.
That's the point. Because usually in Brazil, at least when we think about African background, it's the Afro-Brazilian religions, Candomblé, Umbanda, and when we think about the black brotherhoods, black men brotherhoods, it's a kind of situation of submission and of totally domestication of the slaves and the freed. And in my view, they took the opportunity the slave society gave to them to construct links of solidarity and a space of sociability. The brotherhoods were admitted by the slave owners, the state, the crown, and so they took advantage of that that space given by the establishment, and they turned this space a space to affirm their own identity. And as in Brazil, the Candomblé and Umbanda are very strong. The studies on that issues are very. There are many studies about that, and not the black Catholicism. And so my intention was to show that even when people think that the African people or African descendants were being dominated, they were using the spaces existent in the slavery society to construct a specific identity and to have accepted space to exist. So it's a form of affirming an African identity and a specific identity through integration. and not through resistance and ruin and fight. So I don't think it's contradictory that the religion was from the elite in Congo, or even the Portuguese colonizers, and that this was a thing that gave space for these slaves to affirm themselves. I think it was a kind of wisdom of people to identify how to affirm themselves in a very oppressive and very violent situation.
So, but you say that it became more important in the Americas than it was in Congo itself before the slavery, among the slaves. So do you say that the Catholicism became more important once slaves were amongst slave populations, once they were in the Americas, than it used to be?
Yes, I think so.
In the Congo?
Yes, I think so.
My answer to your question would be, I mean, I wouldn't call myself an expert on Congolese culture, but when I read Thornton and other studies on Congolese society, then my conclusion is that Catholicism was much more than just an elite affair. It was spread out and also reached the common people. And maybe in the eyes of the missionaries that would come, they were not considered Catholics, but the people themselves, identified themselves as Catholic and certainly had some type of Catholic influence. And I'm certainly not suggesting that those slaves who arrived in New Amsterdam were all 100% pious Catholics, but they definitely were baptized. They had some elements influenced by Catholic culture, and they had, and this is then my theory, of course, that they had some knowledge of the whole idea and structure of brotherhoods.
Could we have, you are in, Rebecca as director, I asked you, do we have time for one more question? One more question, yeah. Where? Who's, yes?
I don't have a question, I just have a statement. I'm from New Orleans, and in 1724, before the war.
Please take the mic.
To talk about the prevalence of Catholicism, say in New Orleans or even Saint Domingue, there was a law, the Code Noir, that said that the enslaved Africans had to be baptized as Catholics. So that sometimes those kind of laws increase the prevalence if they were supposed to be.
Thank you, very good point.